Four, three, two, one. Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Bradley J Show. Kind of coming to you from a remote location up in the White Mountains, up in the cabin in the White Mountains. I was able to get a little bit of um, internet access, and so here we are. It's kind of cold. The cabin's kind of warm, but it's kind of breezy outside. And we're with Rich Rubino, who is a political analyst and an historian, and we're going to talk about friction between presidents and vice presidents. Some people have noticed that there is a certain friction between Biden and Harris. Or they say that, but I don't know. The media is always looking for something. So I don't know. I mean, maybe one person made an offhand comment about the other hand. Maybe that was it. Or maybe there's a deep-seated friction that affects things. I don't know. Rich is going to tell us all about that and then wax historical on that same subject. So take it away, Rich Rubino.
Yes, Bradley. Well, essentially, so there's a new book that's coming out, and it essentially says that Doug Emhoff, he's the wife of Kamala Harris, had suggested to certain aides that he thinks Joe Biden is not given the proper decor, I guess, or not that toward Kamala Harris that I guess he had received from Barack Obama. And Joe Biden was supposedly kind of incensed by that because he said, she came up and wanted to be in charge of voting rights, and I basically gave her that. I delegated that to her. I guess the border crisis has really kind of brought down her job approval ratings. I think some Harris people probably see her as a potential presidential candidate, and they're trying to figure out ways that they can get her job approval up from the kind of the 39. Yes,
Question.
sir.
Do you think that Biden farmed that job out to her knowing it was an impossible job so he wouldn't have to be on the hook for it?
No, because I think he's on the hook for it anyways.
All right. Now he can point to somebody and blame them.
When people say any issue where they say the border crisis, people don't usually don't usually deal with who delegated it, who it's delegated to, rather they usually deal with who the actual president of the United States is.
Right.
So I think that's kind of a secondary issue.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt. No, I'm not that sorry, but I did interrupt. I acknowledge that I interrupted, and let's move on.
You're completely forgiven.
Okay.
So I think that supposedly they're supposedly the relationship. So here's the thing. So they, I guess, got along relatively well in the past. Beau Biden, Joe Biden's late son, was Attorney General when Kamala Harris was Attorney General in California, and they worked together sometimes as attorneys general, as it's actually pronounced. So they generally had a good relationship. And then in 2020, during one of the debates, then California Senator Harris kind of went after Joe Biden for his formerly opposition to essentially what was mandated busing. She said, I was remember that line? She said, I was one of the girls who got bussed. So after that, Joe Biden were kind of perplexed why she would go after him because they had such a warm relationship in the past. So, by the way, they never actually served the United States Senate together. Joe Biden, of course, left to become vice president in 2009. And Kamala Harris didn't even get into the Senate until 2017. She had a very short tenure. And then they ran for president against each other 2020. Senator Harris really got nowhere. She had to drop out before Iowa. It was a very disappointing, in part because when she announced her candidacy, she had about 20,000 people at her announcement, and many thought that she was really going to be a kind of quintessential candidate in that race, but she was not. And she dropped out early. And Joe Biden eventually garners the nomination, and he had promised that it was going to be a woman as his running mate. She was a senator from the largest state in the country. There were certainly advocates for her. There were other candidates as well. Val Demings, the congresswoman from Florida, was one of them. Hilda Solis, the former labor secretary under the Obama administration. There were others, but Biden somewhat reluctantly chose Harris, and she did relatively well during the campaign. If anything, she was kind of a non-entity, if you will. But she does not really have much of a core constituency as many other presidential candidates have, and that's part of the reason. Actually, it's something that Harris and Biden have in common. When Joe Biden ran in 1998, he actually had to drop out because, if you remember, there was a scandal, and it turned out. So John Sasso, who worked for Mike Dukakis, the Democratic frontrunner, found that he had actually plagiarized essentially a speech from Neil Kinnock, who was the labor leader. And that was leaked to the media, and they showed both of them giving the same address. Then it turned out that he'd also taken certain parts of speeches from Hubert Humphrey and Robert F. Kennedy, respectively. Eventually, Biden dropped out. he was thinking of running in 2004, but his wife really did not want him to run that year. So he ran again in 2008, and he was really kind of a backbencher candidate. 2008, you had Hillary Clinton, John Edwards, and Barack Obama as the major candidates, and then you had Joe Biden, Chris Dodd, and Bill Richardson trying to kind of get to that first tier. Biden never got there. He dropped out right after Iowa. So very similar to Vice President Harris in that they both ran relatively poor campaigns and really got nowhere in their presidential races. So he chose Harris, and then eventually Biden becomes president. And they've had a relatively, from what I hear, it's a relatively cordial relationship, but it's not necessarily a warm relationship. Like for example, Obama's relationship with Joe Biden, with by all accounts, even though they'd run against each other in 2008, they had a relatively warm relationship.
Wow. Excuse me. Do you think, this is an opinion, do you think Harris would be a good president?
I'm going to stay out of that one.
You don't like you don't do opinions? Okay. So you think no, huh? All right. Well, I'm going to have to assume, should I assume that it's a no? I mean, usually there would be no skin off your back to say yes, but I suppose that's taking a position too, and you don't want to take any position. Okay. Let's go back through time, set the Wayback Machine to whatever you want, and talk about some contentious relationships between presidents and vice presidents. This is your wheelhouse. Go for it.
Oh, yes, categorically. So relationships, and actually Thomas Jefferson and his vice president, the inimitable George Clinton, had some tensions. But interestingly, this was right after the 12th Amendment, which allowed for a president and a vice president to essentially be picked on the same ticket. Prior to that, it was the president, and then it was whoever came in second place would become president. So actually, Jefferson came in second to John Adams in 1796, and then Thomas Jefferson eventually became vice president. But they really didn't have much in common. Actually, yes.
Is that second in terms of popular vote or electoral votes?
That was second in terms of electoral vote.
I see.
So Jefferson, so whoever comes in first at the time becomes president. Whoever comes in second becomes vice president.
So if that system were still in effect, you could have had a situation where Trump was president and Hillary was vice president, right?
Yes, theoretically.
Which I can't believe they would ever have that crazy setup. Maybe that's better. I don't know.
There are all sorts of scenarios, and it's interesting. It's like for governors, it's actually, we have kind of an archaic system, if you will. It's almost antediluvian, and that sometimes a governor and a lieutenant governor will be elected from different parties. When George W. Bush was running for re-election in 1998, his father, his entire family was doing everything they could because they were trying to focus on the lieutenant governor's election. Bush had a 70% job approval rating. He landed up winning re-election with 68%. Rick Perry was running for lieutenant governor. So why was that so important? Because Bush knew that if a Democrat was elected as lieutenant governor, when Bush was out of the state, essentially the Democratic governor could do everything possible to embarrass him in the state of Texas. And if Bush becomes president, then the state goes to a Democratic governor. There was a governor in California who was thinking about running, who was on George H.W. Bush's, this is George Sejujian, his short list for vice presidential candidates in 1998. And he voluntarily took his name off the list because he said a Democrat is going to become governor of California. Now, if Bush was running for president, a Democrat had won that race, people might say, you're just giving the Texas governorship automatically to a Democrat. Pete Wilson, 1996, even though in 1994 he had promised the people of California running for re-election against Kathleen Brown that he would serve out his full term. In 1996, he decides he's going to run for president. He breaks that promise, saying he'd do more for California as governor as president rather than as governor. But you know who the lieutenant governor was? Gray Davis, a Democrat. So whenever Wilson was out of the state, Gray Davis could have done anything possible to embarrass him. He didn't, because Wilson never really became a frontier candidate. But if Pete Wilson were to become president or vice president, a Democrat would have succeeded him. So now we at least have a system where the president and the vice president are at least of the same party.
All right.
At least there is a couple of constitutional loopholes where you could have a president, a vice president from another party, but that's perhaps too Byzantine. So what happened was Thomas Jefferson, this was the first time, this was the election of 1808, and Thomas Jefferson wanted James Madison to succeed him as president. So James Madison, he also wanted James Madison to be Secretary of State. And back then, Secretary of State was really a gangway for the presidency, not the vice president. So he said, put George Clinton, who's 69 years old, by the way, a former governor of New York, and up until Tom Vilsack was governor of Iowa, he was the longest serving governor of any state in American history. So he says to George Clinton, and it's not like, a president directly picks the vice president, but back then you can endorse somebody. He wanted to be a running mate, essentially just as kind of a placeholder. The problem is George Clinton was somewhat independent of Thomas Jefferson in some of his foreign policy decisions. Sometimes on a Senate vote, he would actually not vote the way Thomas Jefferson voted. And he ran for president himself, despite what James Madison had, this is not 1800, this is 1804. In 1804, the thought was in 1808, Jefferson doesn't run for re-election, okay? And instead, James Madison runs. So James Madison does run, George Clinton runs as well and loses. But there are still some Jefferson critics. This is the Democratic Republican Party, which I guess you could call the Libertarian Party or the Republican Party of 1808, who still wanted him to remain as vice president, to be kind of a check, if you will, on the Jefferson-Madison foreign policy. So he runs again, and again he becomes vice president, and now he's a thorn in the side of James Madison, and he doesn't even attend James Madison's inauguration because of the tension between them. So that's probably I think that was probably the first really, well, Jefferson Adams was different because they were elected separately, but that was really, I think, the most contentious relationship, at least in the 1800s. But there are a few others that I think are very interesting.
Okay.
One of them.
Before you go to them, can I ask a question about the 1800s? It strikes me that the whole thing was very rickety back then, and could have come apart. What if something had happened like then that happened on January 6th? The Union wasn't as strong then, I don't think. Could that have, if Trump had done that back then, could that have destroyed the whole thing? And what would have played out then if January 6th had happened in 1808?
That is a really great question, and I can see that happening because there were a lot of tensions. And I wouldn't even say 1808 necessarily, as much as I would say that entire founding generation. If you go back to the Constitutional Convention, for example, in 1787, that hot summer in Philadelphia, there were those who were called the Anti-Federalists, who were against the idea of changing the Articles of Confederation or Perpetual Union, which was the precursor to the Constitution, which really limited the federal government, because they thought the Constitution would, as Patrick Henry say, has an awful squinting. It squints toward monarchy. They thought that the Constitution would create too large of a federal government. So they went in Philadelphia. By the way, the summit in Philadelphia, the only purpose was supposed to be to amend the Articles. That was it. Instead, they came out and they effectuated this completely new document, which gave more power to the federal government and less power, if you will, to the people or to the states, respectively. There was not necessarily a revolution in terms of a military revolution like there was for the Revolutionary War. We had obviously gone from being basically the Mayflower Compact, which was somewhat of a theocratic direct democracy, to somewhat of a system that is somewhat federal, that gives some power to the states, some power to the federal government. But there wasn't a revolution in terms of a military revolution. Would that have happened potentially if, say, James Madison had instituted an insurrection? I don't know. It's a great question. My guess is that probably very few people would have actually known about it, first of all, because it would take time for it to travel all the way from, this is prior to Western Union, all the way to all the way from from one side of the country, what there was one side, to the other side. But I don't know. That's a great question.
What was it? Was the Whiskey Rebellion something that would be? I mean, of course, not over the same thing, but did it rise to that level?
No, that was Shays' Rebellion. That was actually in Western Mass. No, I don't think it rose to the level because it would not. I mean, yes, it was military, but that was more of, I think, I don't know, and I think annoyance is probably too light of a word, but it's certainly not something that I would. It's not tantamount to an insurrection. That's Grenada versus World War II.
Good, well put. So back to other interesting frictions between presidents and vice presidents.
Yes. So Theodore Roosevelt, actually. So actually, William McKinley, his vice president, Garrett Hobart, and they had a very good relationship. And at the time, by the way, once again, presidents and vice presidents, the president did not pick the vice president. They were essentially nominated separately, although the presidential nominee could certainly make recommendations. But in 1890, so he died. They had a very good relationship. And Thomas Platt and basically the hierarchy of New York wanted Theodore Roosevelt out of New York politics. He was governor. He was rising rapidly through the ascending rapidly. He'd given 19 speeches at one time in 1898 on one day running for governor. So they wanted him out of there because they thought that he was too much of a reformist. They thought he was too liberal. So the conservative bloodline basically persuaded the Republican Party, you need this guy as vice president. And eventually he becomes the vice presidential nominee. Then they say, well, he can't do much as vice president. He's, maybe preside over the Senate a couple of times. He's not going to do much, but he's out of here. So Roosevelt becomes vice president, and he didn't do much as vice president. He was actually up in New York vacationing when he found out that William McKinley was assassinated his first year in office. And then Thomas Platt said, now that darn cowboy is our president. And he was president. So he did not have a vice president at the time, because prior to the 25th Amendment to the Constitution, if there was a vacancy in the vice president, there was no mechanism for a president to choose a new vice president. So he didn't have a vice president for the first term, and he was seen as a kind of a progressive Republican. In 1904, there were two bloodlines in the party, and the other bloodline was the conservatives. You could say the William McKinley wing, and he wanted to do something. The Republicans wanted to do something to unify the party. So they essentially chose Charles Fairbanks, and Charles Fairbanks was extremely conservative. Theodore Roosevelt had a respective square deal policy. His social programs, breaking up trusts, conservation. Charles Fairbanks was incredulous toward most of that. So as a result, Theodore Roosevelt barely even met with Charles Fairbanks. At one time, there was a chandelier, and Roosevelt was carrying the chandelier, and he says, why don't you have Charles Fairbanks deal with that chandelier so he has something to do? And you hear us all the time that a president will endorse their vice president, whether Bill Clinton endorsed Al Gore, for example, in 2000, where sometimes they do not. 1968, Johnson did not endorse Humphrey in the primaries until he got the nomination. Even after that, Reagan did not endorse Bush till he had essentially gotten the nomination. He actually called him Bush inadvertently. But in 1908, Charles Fairbanks sought the Republican Party nomination, and Theodore Roosevelt instead endorsed William Howard Taft, the former Major General Governor of the Philippines, because he thought he was closer to him as kind of his heir. So he endorses Fairbanks to become vice president. He endorsed Taft. Taft ends up winning. Fairbanks goes back to Indiana. Then in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt, the Republican National Convention, Theodore Roosevelt runs for president, loses, then he declares his own independent candidacy, and Charles Fairbanks was out campaigning for William Howard Taft against his former, I guess you'd call it boss, Theodore Roosevelt that year. So they had somewhat of a contentious relationship. And then Charles Fairbanks later in 1916 comes back into politics, and actually a rare occurrence, he's a vice presidential nominee with Charles Evan Hughes, the party's nominee that year. So that was, I think, one of the really tense relationships. Can you talk about friction? Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge had a relatively cordial relationship when he was vice president under Warren G. Harding. Then in 1924, the convention chose Charles W. Dawes, and this was poor right off the bat. Now, Charles W. Dawes went out campaigned all over the country for Calvin Coolidge. They had somewhat of a cordial relationship during the campaign. Now, back then, the inauguration was March 1st, not January 2nd. The Constitution later changed it. But essentially, at March 4th, in that inauguration, you would have the vice president, his role as president of the Senate. He's actually paid by the legislature, not the executive, would give a speech. Then they'd go and the president would deliver his inaugural address. So he gives a speech and he excoriates United States Senate rules. Usually the speech is supposed to be, I'm honored to be vice president. This is going to be a great 4 years, something like that. And then he essentially, exits stage left, and then they go over and the president's inaugurated. So Coolidge gives kind of a few platitudes in his speech. The next day, the coverage is about Charles W. Dawes, not about Calvin Coolidge. And Coolidge is incensed by that, and the relationship is very poor. And the other thing that happened, Charles W. Dawes is vice president. He would preside, when he presided over the Senate, he liked to take a nap every day in his office for about an hour. and when the Senate was on break, so his opponents, many of them Republicans, decided they would schedule a vote on the Attorney General nominee that was against the Coolidge administration while he was taking a nap. So they did that, and they won. It lost by one vote, and this also incensed Coolidge because he found out that his vice president was taking a nap every day. Now, in 1927, Coolidge he goes into South Dakota. He's in vacationing in the Black Hills of South Dakota and gives a ticker tape to all the reporters, and it says, "I do not choose to run in 1928," and leaves. So Charles W. Dawes is one of the candidates running for president that year, and Coolidge makes everything to the Republican Party, because at the time primaries were de minimis. It was really decided at the convention that he would take it as a personal insult if Dawes were to win. And he did not. Charles Dawes did not get the nomination, and then Charles Dawes wanted to become vice president, and he made a case again that he did not want Charles W. Dawes to become the vice presidential nominee, and the convention agreed with him, and Charles W. Dawes was not the convention's nominee, and so that was a very, very poor relationship between those two.
And that was you say the worst, probably?
Debatable.
All right.
Probably Franklin Roosevelt actually, and John Nance Garner was pretty poor, but it began pretty strong. So John Nance Garner was Speaker of the House from Texas. In 1932, John Nance Garner, former Governor Al Smith of New York, and current Governor of New York, Franklin D. Roosevelt, are all running for the Democratic presidential nomination. Roosevelt wins the most votes. John Nance Garner garners the vice presidential nomination. Garner was very conservative. Roosevelt ran as a relatively conservative candidate that year. He wanted to balance the federal budget, even though it was a time of the Depression. And Franklin D. Roosevelt and John Nance Garner tried to run to the right sometimes of Herbert Hoover on issues like trade. At one point, John Nance Garner said that Hoover's policies are bringing us toward socialism. Imagine a Republican saying that about a Democrat saying that about a Republican. So Roosevelt wins. The first 100 days, they have a relatively amicable or cordial, if you will, relationship. And Garner does everything he can to bring some of the New Deal programs into effect. He supports them. He campaigns for them. He advocates for them. Then Roosevelt gets reelected in 1936. Only loses 2 states, Maine and Vermont. Then he decides a couple of things. First of all, he wants to pack the court, because the Supreme Court kept on ruling against much of his legislation. They ruled it constitutionally impermissible. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt does not like that, and decides that there should essentially, once a Supreme Court justice becomes a certain age, he should be able to appoint or nominate another Supreme Court justice. Garner thinks that's going too far. Then, in 1938, Roosevelt decides, almost like a Caesar, he's going to campaign against conservative Democrats in primaries. And these conservative Democrats were John Nance Garner's constituency. These were the people who supported him in 1932. This was his base. This absolutely incensed him. Roosevelt's going around the country campaigning against his members of his own party, and he failed miserably in that effort. He failed miserably in the general election, too. So there was a time for about 9 months where, even though they were right down the street from each other, they literally did not speak. Finally, they had a meeting, and by all intents and purposes, we have no idea, we have no ideation whatsoever what actually happened in that conclave. John Nance Garner, in 1939, decides he's going to run for president. He doesn't think Roosevelt was actually going to run for president. Then Roosevelt decides he's going to run for an unprecedented 3rd term. Only Ulysses Grant had tried that, and he didn't do it consecutively. So Garner still runs. So you have this scenario. You have the vice president running against the president of his own party for the Democratic nomination, and you have James Farley, the postmaster general, and the chairman of the Democratic Party throws his hat in the ring for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1940. Imagine if this happened today. Imagine if the president is running, and then let's say Donald Trump was running for re-election, and let's say Mike Pence decides he's going to run against him, and then Ronna McDaniel, the chairman of the Republican National Committee, runs against them, both of them as well. You had that scenario. Roosevelt wins. John Nance Garner is not vice presidential nominee. Instead, it goes to Henry Wallace. They probably never talked again. And interestingly, though, he lived till he was about 99 years old. And the last call that John F. Kennedy made the day he was assassinated, he gave a call to John Nance Garner to wish him a happy birthday. So John Nance Garner was still alive in 1963, and to receive that call from John F. Kennedy that fateful day in Dallas.
Since we're talking about presidential vice presidential relationships, we really will need to talk more about Trump and Pence. And you talked about the previous situation where they never talked again. I can't imagine where Pence would ever talk to Trump again unless after this election, win, lose, or draw. After it's over, I can't imagine. I mean, think how deep down inside Pence must really feel about Trump, who allegedly encouraged a mob to insurrection, and that mob had erected gallows. I mean, it could be said that President Trump's action truly endangered Pence's life. Yet, Pence, in order to maintain a shred of a chance to get elected, can't speak his mind about how he really feels about Trump. Deep down inside, the relationship must be maybe the worst. I mean, has any president ever done anything as awful to any vice president ever?
No, but I will say that Mike Pence has said that they have had meetings, and that after Donald Trump, I guess, called him in for a meeting, and basically Mike Pence explained his situation. Donald Trump just kind of said, that's something to the effect of, "That's why I chose you, for your honesty," something like that. And Mike Pence, he just came out with his new book, and that's basically what he said, that they have had a few conversations. And then he's called a couple of times after his presidency. But Mike Pence, the thing that I think Mike Pence said, essentially, "I'm praying for you, Mr. President." And then Donald Trump went out and went after Mike Pence. He was after people on the stump, but then in person, there's obviously a different caricature of Donald Trump, and that's kind of what Mike Pence is basically saying. And I do think that there is a possibility that could have the same scenario as 1940. In this case, it would be a former vice president and a former president running against each other. The other thing Trump has said before, he said that he was going to lose re-election as governor of Indiana, and I basically took him out of Indiana and I made him vice president. Well, there may have actually been some veracity to that, because that was essentially Mike Pence had been elected governor. Indiana is one of the 10 states that they elect their governors the same year as the presidential race. So he was about tied in his re-election bid. And it came down to Newt Gingrich, Chris Christie, and Mike Pence. And Donald Trump was persuaded by his coefficients that he should pick Mike Pence to shore up the evangelical vote. That was his base constituency, and to help him with conservatives who were very skeptical of his conservative bona fides. So he did that, although he was thinking Gingrich might have actually been a choice that would be more palatable to him, but he chose him. And they actually, at least publicly, during that first term, they were very much in cahoots, and they would very much campaign around the country, sometimes together. And Mike Pence would often say, I wish you greetings from the president of the United States," that type of thing. And Mike Pence still praises Donald Trump as president, even though he certainly is not Donald Trump, the human being.
Do you think that's just for self-serving political reasons that he does that praising?
I think that he wants to run on the record without the person. I think that's what he's trying to do. Donald Trump is still enormously popular with Republican constituents. So I think he doesn't. Plus, it's hard to say if you've been vice president or administration to then go in and say, "Well, we failed here, we failed here, we failed there." Obviously, you have to paint a rosy picture, and that's certainly.
Yeah, I guess he's kind of on the hook for whatever happened during the administration, so he has to be pro that administration.
It's interesting you brought that up, because another interesting analogy is actually Hubert Humphrey and Lyndon Johnson. In 1964. Hubert Humphrey and Eugene McCarthy, both senators from Minnesota, are the two respective vice presidential candidates. Johnson chooses Humphrey. So Johnson wins re-election 1964, 61% of the vote, biggest landslide since FDR in 1936. The only states he loses are southern states, except for Barry Goldwater's opponent's home state in Arizona. So Hubert Humphrey talks about Vietnam, and he says, "You have the most political capital of any president just about now." He said, "It's time to get out, and it's time to stop the bombing of North Vietnam." Him and George Ball, the Assistant Secretary of State, were the only real defectors on Vietnam. So Johnson would listen. He'd hear Robert McNamara, George Bundy, the other members of the administration say, "We have to continue the bombing." Humphrey saying that there's no way to win over there, and now is the time to pull out. And he actually sends him a memo explaining the reasons why you need to pull out of Vietnam. And Johnson does not like it, and he bans Hubert Humphrey from any national security meetings. There's actually a song, Whatever Became of Poor Hubert, and that was because Hubert Humphrey was almost excommunicated from the administration. He wasn't out speaking. People never knew what happened to him. Then in 1966, Johnson gave Humphrey one last chance and sent him to Vietnam. He went there, met with General William Westmoreland, met with the military folks. He came back an exponent, an advocate, if you will, of the Vietnam War. He said it was part of the global war on poverty, and people that were close to Humphrey were scratching their head. They said, this is never the Hubert Humphrey we've been grown to love or whatever. And Hubert Humphrey was now in Johnson's camp. He would send Johnson his speeches about Vietnam. Johnson liked him, so Johnson brought him back into his conclave, brought him back into his assemblage, brought him back into the national security meetings. But Johnson, because he was a hawk, he was somewhat gradual escalation was his policy, and Humphrey was not on the reservation. He did not accept him. Then when he did accept him, he would bring him to the national security meetings because he essentially was on the same page, and you had this kind of groupthink, if you will, and then Ball was really the only dissenting voice. But in 1968, after Johnson doesn't run for president and Humphrey runs for president instead, Humphrey has now become, and this is so ironic, he becomes the face card of the Vietnam War. People view him now as the tribune of the Johnson administration's policy, which is becoming less and less popular on Vietnam. And Humphrey doesn't win a single primary. He goes to the convention, wins all the party hawks, the Johnson people at the convention. Eugene McCarthy, actually, ironically, the guy who he had run against, well, you don't really run against, but Johnson's other choice for vice president, is now the advocate of the anti-Vietnam War crusade. And the McCarthy people are inflamed that Humphrey wins the nomination. So they're protesting Grant Park in Chicago. And on September 30th, Humphrey calls up President Johnson, and he says, Mr. President, I just want you to know I'm in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I'm going to deliver a speech, and I'm going to announce a unilateral bombing halt as an acceptable risk for peace. And Johnson basically said, if you do that, there's going to be blood on your hands. Supposedly, this was not on tape. There's other tape, but supposedly Johnson had said that to Humphrey, because if you stop a bombing halt, they're going to continue bombing, and they're going to continue bombing our troops. And Humphrey said, I think this is an acceptable risk. So he goes out and he delivers that speech. All of a sudden, he was 15 points down. There's a proliferation of support of young people. The McCarthy people come to him. All these protests that he had are almost de minimis, almost null set or non-existent, if you will. Now you have a scenario where Johnson is not campaigning for Humphrey. He gives kind of his very lukewarm support. But later in the campaign, when Johnson finds out that Richard Nixon had sent an emissary, Ann Chennault, to South Vietnam, when Johnson was set up peace talks right before the election in 68 between the North, the U.S., and the South, to tell the South Vietnamese and President Tu they could get a better deal under the Nixon administration, Johnson goes all in for Humphrey. Not because he liked Humphrey necessarily, but because he now said, this is my vice president, I want this guy to win. So he basically campaigned in Texas, probably won Texas for him, and then Humphrey barely lost, and he called up Lyndon Johnson that day and says, I think Mr. President, I've let you down right after that loss. And Johnson said, oh no, you haven't let me down. There's the people around you that have let me down. But he said, you ran a good campaign. But interestingly, Humphrey runs again in 1972. Johnson does not endorse Humphrey in the primary. He stays neutral, although Terry Sanford, the governor of North Carolina, comes to Texas and meets with him at his ranch, and Johnson hands him a copy of his new book, The Vantage Point, autographed with a $500 check. So he did not support Humphrey when he ran for president himself in 72.
Wow. I think right now Johnson's my most interesting president.
I agree.
You say that Trump is still enormously popular with the Republicans. I don't know if I mean, you're more of an expert than I am, but I keep my eye on this a lot, and I guess it depends on how you define enormously popular. It just seems to be, even Steve Bannon says, I can't watch that anymore when he's talking about those these NFT cards that he had put out. And now with, the revelations of the tax returns, and see, I don't think he can win, and I don't think they want to run somebody that can't win. I think this is my theory. He's very vindictive, so if he's not the nominee, he'll run as an independent.
Yeah.
And the other incentive for that is it's harder to indict him when he's running for office. So I think he won't be the nominee. He will run as an independent. And I hope that no indictments come down until after he's clearly not running. Maybe the election has to be over. You can do Giuliani and these other people. In the meantime, try to flip them. But I hope we don't get any indictments for former President Trump till his involvement in any election is over, because we don't want to inflame, or, it would only help him politically. So I hope they don't. What do you think?
I actually think that's a scenario where I can totally see right now. He was never a Republican. He used to give money to both sides. He gave a lot of money to folks like Nancy Pelosi and his Senator Chuck Schumer. He used to praise during the Monica Lewinsky scandal. He praised Bill Clinton. He talked about how great Hillary Clinton was when she got in the United States Senate. And in 2000, he seriously considered running for president as the Reform Party nominee. So he's never really been much of a Republican. I can see the scenario where he essentially says, my party is no longer, my party has left me. He'll talk about a couple issues, something to that effect. And he'll say, the only way I'm going to win, he says, I'm going to win. I'm going to get out of the whole system. He's going to say both sides are corrupt. And he runs as an independent.
He might even run as an independent simply to punish the Republican Party, to bring them down. He's that vindictive.
I think that maybe, I don't know if that would be his, just like anybody else, human beings are complex creatures and we have a multiplicity of motivations. In his case, I think one of his motivations is he probably sees a scenario, and I think somewhere in the recesses of his membrane, he sees a scenario where he's actually going to win as an independent, where he's going to galvanize all the support. I don't think it's realistic, but I think he probably sees something to that effect. I also think he likes the process of running for president. He likes doing rallies. Even when he was president, he was doing rallies. He likes the process of going out. He likes the idea of, going. He doesn't like to shake hands. He likes the idea of speaking before tens of thousands of people.
He likes the personal adulation, and who wouldn't? I would too.
Absolutely.
He's really good at them. He's really terrible at other things. Like, did you see the pitch for his NFT playing cards or whatever they call them? He looked so bad. It looked embarrassing. It was just like when he was doing his failed pitch for the Trump stakes. He's really bad at that and looks sad. So that's not his strength. That's just something that I noticed. Okay. Anything else? What else? I think I had something I wanted to. Oh yeah.
Yes.
A recommendation for something to watch. Accidentally, I watch YouTube. I'll watch one thing and then something else pops up. I'll be doing jobs and something else pops up. And something else popped up, and what it was, a big long interview with former judge, they still call him judge, Michael Luttig. Are you familiar with Michael Luttig?
A little bit.
Okay. So like January 4th, January 5th, when things are getting tough, and Pence didn't really know how to act because Trump was pressuring him to overturn the election results. He didn't know. He wanted some legal ground to stand on. He wanted to be able to point to some official thing and say, I can't do it. I don't have the authority. And he had, I don't remember his assistant's name, but his assistant knew this former judge, Michael Luttig. And he's been out of the business for a long time, but I guess he had great respect for having extreme knowledge on this situation. So this Michael Luttig was in Colorado with his wife having dinner. He hadn't been anything near close to this for a long time. And his friend, who was currently then working for Pence, said, we need you to write something now, right now, like now, in an hour, that can give Pence legal grounds that he can point to. And this guy didn't even know how to tweet. They didn't know how to get the message out. He said, we need you to get the message out. Figure it out. And the guy says, I'm calling you back in 10 minutes. Did you figure out how to do it? No, I'm calling you back in 5 minutes. He said, actually, and then Luttig said, I don't really know how to tweet, but I'll try to tweet something. So right on the spot, he went and wrote something. I think he wrote it in Word. He wrote it on his laptop and sent it and got it into a tweet somehow and sent it as a tweet. But he didn't really even know how to tweet. He's on the spot. And he said, I gave it everything I had. There probably were some typos, but huge pressure. The history, the direction of the country is on the hook. And he gets a call, write this opinion right now. And you know how judges have to, it takes a long time. It's ponderous. You don't want to make a mistake. You could cite the correct law, etc. He was under such pressure. And he did that. And within a few minutes, I guess, it was in the New York Times, or a few hours anyway. And I just recommend this interview. It was on PBS. It's not that I'm a big, giant PBS fan. Not that I'm not a PBS fan. I don't want the fact that I saw it on PBS to give anybody any ideas about my political leanings. But there it was. I thought it was super, super interesting. I think you would love it. And he really is good about explaining the extreme stress of that moment. He just was freaked out. And so his opinion is the opinion that Pence uses. I think you'd like it.
Well, you know, it's fascinating, and I'm going to watch that. The other person that he called was the last vice president before him, who was a Hoosier, who was from Indiana, and he called Dan Quayle and asked Dan Quayle's advice. And Dan Quayle basically said the election was not stolen. He said, you have no grounds here. He said, you're basically, this is a ministerial role you have. This is all ceremonial. You have no grounds under the Electoral Count Act. Just stop it, basically. Quayle now lives in Arizona, and Quayle said, you know, I'm out here. Basically, trust me, there's nothing going on here in Arizona. And that was supposedly part of Mike Pence's decision not to go with what Trump and his coefficients wanted. But that's fascinating.
Okay. I guess that's it for today. Not bad. I loved it. It was great. I think we had to do a show on a radio. Maybe, I don't know, some political. Which of the radio stations out there do a lot of politics? Let's see. Well, we should talk about that. Okay.
I'd love to. Absolutely.
I'm sure you would. So would I. That's it. So where are you going to be? Where can tell the people about your books? Tell the people about your any appearances you have coming up.
Yeah. Well, I was just on a station Word in Greenville, South Carolina this morning, talking about presidential Christmases. And for example, how Benjamin Harrison was the first president back in 1889 to have a White House Christmas tree indoors. Of course, then it was an executive mansion. So I guess we call it the executive mansion Christmas tree. And just another thing, Theodore Roosevelt did not have trees in the White House because he was a conservationist. But one time in 1902, one of his sons snuck a tree into the closet. And Theodore Roosevelt saw it and said, okay, you can keep it, but don't tell the press. So that type of thing's interesting.
You know what's weird? It's weird that he would not have a tree in the house, in the executive mansion, because he's a conservationist, but he would kill animals, even though he was a conservationist. I would think you could apply the same rationale for the culling of the herd to the culling of the trees. I see a little bit of a conflict there.
Yes.
Okay, your books. Tell me about the books.
The latest book is the Great American Political Trivia Challenge, political trivia on steroids.
Yeah.
2,512 questions, all political trivia, mostly interesting, not just questions and answers. So that's my latest Bible.
I'm gonna ask you to give me a political trivia question, a super hard one. That way, when I don't get it, I won't be embarrassed. Okay, give me one so hard that there's no way I'd get it.
A super hard one. Okay. Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
She once worked for a future president. Which future president back in when he was a member of Congress did she work for indirectly as a member of the conference, not his constituency, but as a member of the conference?
Joe Biden.
Chairman of his conference. Gerald Ford.
Gerald Ford. Wow, man.
Because she worked, so this is interesting. She went to Wellesley College, right here in Wellesley, Massachusetts.
Yep.
She was head of the Young Republicans her freshman year, not Democrat, Republicans.
Wow.
She had been chairman, done the same thing in high school in Park Ridge, Illinois. She was a Goldwater girl, the most conservative candidate who ran that year.
Right? Wow.
And then later on, actually, Bill Clinton on her 40th birthday had Barry Goldwater call her to wish a happy birthday. And in 1996, when they were campaigning in Arizona, they both went out of their way to visit Barry Goldwater in Arizona. Barry Goldwater was the guy I mentioned earlier who only won 6 states because he was so conservative. He sat at the Republican convention, the Cow Palace, San Francisco. Let me remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice.
Yeah.
Moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. That's Barry Goldwater.
It's a nice slogan, but didn't work very
No.
well for him. Did Hillary have conservative parents, and then when she
Yes.
got to college, she said, "Whoa, I'm
Yes.
changed. This is more fun to be on the left."
She had this story. So yes, she had very conservative parents, certainly a father. But she also had a minister who was very liberal, who would take her, for example, to hear Martin Luther King, very much a fan of Martin Luther King. She got to college, and part of it was she thought the Republicans moved too slowly on civil rights. The other thing was she became an opponent of Vietnam. So in 1968, she supported Eugene McCarthy, actually the Democratic nominee, anti-Vietnam. But she also supported on the Republican side the liberal Republican governor, Nelson Rockefeller. But after that, she was advised that you still need to figure out where you're going to, if you're a Republican or Democrat, we should work for the Republican conference. So she actually worked for Mel Laird directly. Mel Laird was the congressman from Wisconsin who later became Richard Nixon's Secretary of Defense. And there's a picture actually of Gerald Ford, Mel Laird, and Hillary Clinton, because Gerald Ford was the chairman of the Republican conference. And there's a picture of all three of them together. And Gerald Ford, Hillary Clinton later showed it to Ford when Hillary Clinton was first lady, and she said, "Yeah, he's the one that kind of got away." But it's interesting how she did do somewhat of a transmogrification ideologically from somebody who was kind of not only the right, but kind of the far right of the spectrum. And imagine being chairman, being the president of the Young Republicans as a freshman at a good school like Wellesley. You have to be pretty conservative to do that, and because if anything, if it's a Wellesley College, you're saying that how many Republicans are there in Wellesley? Maybe at Wellesley College, but obviously if the members, if people who are kind of iconoclastic, obviously if you're going to be iconoclastic, if you're going to be not a misanthrope, but an iconoclastic, if you will, if you're going to be part of the Wellesley College Young Republicans, chances are you're probably also conservative, not necessarily a moderate. So they chose Hillary Clinton, and eventually Clinton kind of moved to the left because of Vietnam. But then, she's always kind of moved around a little bit. Certainly, when she was in Arkansas, for example, she led the movement for requiring teacher competency testing, which inflamed the unions. And Arkansas became the first state to require, back in 1986, to require that teachers pass competency testing. So she's taken on the right, she's taken on the left, but it's certainly an interesting political evolution for her.
Oh, I have one more question that's kind of an opinion, but you won't get in any trouble for it.
Oh,
I'm referring to the session where Zelensky spoke.
Yep.
And it struck me that was a really, I may be naive. To me, it seemed like, wow, that's a pretty genius move, because when he walked in, the response was visceral. I was like, whoa! It didn't seem fake at all. When they saw him in the flesh, it was the real deal. And it seems like really smart to get this visceral gung-ho thing going right at the time when funding is being decided.
Yeah.
So do you think it really had an effect or not?
Yeah, I don't know. We're going to have to see. Part of it, I think, is he knows American politics. He knows that the Republicans are going to take over the House of Representatives in early January. He knows that there is a caucus in the Republican Party that is against the idea of funding the Ukraine. He knows he has to do something to propitiate their constituents. So he comes here and he gets national coverage. The networks are all covering it. He comes in there. He comes in there, like a phoenix rising right from the ashes. You have Republicans, you have Democrats all applauding him. But I still think there's going to be a constituency. By the way, it's a constituency in the Democratic Party as well that questions the idea of funding the Ukraine. But he knows that it's going to be different with Nancy Pelosi not Speaker of the House, and with whoever the Republican, if they're assuming this is a Republican Speaker of the House, he knows it's going to be different. So he has to, I think, from a public relations standpoint, take up Nancy Pelosi's invitation. Obviously, kind of surreptitiously coming to the United States, coming to Washington. And it's very rare that you have an actual foreign leader speaking before a joint session of the United States Congress. But my guess is there's still going to be a constituency that's going to be against the idea of funding. I think part of it, too, he's probably trepidatious that Kevin McCarthy will make a deal in order to garner 218 votes, in order to get some of these. Right now, there's about 5 that are called never Kevin McCarthy people, and there are others that are questioning, well, maybe I'll support him. Part of that might be if he says, I'm either going to diminish or eliminate funding. I don't think you say eliminate, but diminish funding for the Ukraine. I think that's why the president had to come to the United States.
Yeah, but if he bends to the will of these few extremists that don't want to fund Ukraine, aren't there blowback from the rest? I mean, there are consequences for something like that. I mean, he will get their vote, but doesn't that affect things on the other end somehow?
Right now, Kevin McCarthy wants to be Speaker of the United States House of Representatives. The question is, how far will he go to become Speaker? I don't know how far he's actually going to go. I know that there are about 5 members who are saying under no circumstances. Matt Gaetz is one of them. Ralph Norman's another one from South Carolina. Andy Biggs from Arizona. We're saying under no circumstances will we support Kevin McCarthy. There are others that are very much questioning. I think they're going to support him at the end. But if you look at what he needs 218 votes, and there's going to be essentially 223 Republicans. So he can basically have to win with less. He can allow maybe 3 or 4 votes, people to vote present. My guess is he'll do anything he possibly can. Will he promise to take them off committees? Will he tell other Republicans? My guess is if he does that, they're going to go back to their constituents and say, I'm a hero, because Kevin McCarthy has said he's going to take me off of my committees, and they're going to make this kind of a populist campaign against Kevin McCarthy, the way that Mitch McConnell has become persona non grata amongst the conservative intelligentsia right now. But it's fascinating. You have Marjorie Taylor Greene very much advocating for Kevin McCarthy, in part because Kevin McCarthy will put her on a committee. And then you have folks like Matt Gaetz on the other side who are going after Marjorie Taylor Greene now, and basically saying, well, isn't she the one who talked about Jewish people starting wildfires with space lasers? So there's really kind of a friction amongst that conservative caucus in the Republican Party. But it's interesting that Marjorie Taylor Greene is basically almost whipping for Kevin McCarthy. And Donald Trump, by the way, is also whipping for Kevin McCarthy because he says that he's the only alternative we have.
It's interesting to see how things work out. Back to the Zelensky thing.
Yeah.
In addition to directly affecting viscerally in the same room, he had to be a big winner with the American people, who would indirectly then pressure their representatives, their senators, and their House members to continue to fund. It makes it harder for.
Yeah, but you have a scenario. You look at folks like Ralph Norman, but you look like Ralph Norman, Marjorie Taylor Greene. They come from constituencies where, first of all, they're Democrats, but the Democrats this is districts where the Democrats will get 30% of the vote if they're lucky. And they're Republicans in those districts are the most conservative Republicans in the country. They're people that are to the right to Mitch McConnell, to the right of Donald Trump, to the right of Kevin McCarthy. That's why Marjorie Taylor Greene can win with basically nominal opposition in that district. So I think that President Zelensky is very unpopular in these congressional districts. There's not really a constituency for him. And it's also on the left too, because there are some members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, if you will, that were also against funding the Ukraine. So I think that the folks in the middle, the center right, the center left, the establishment people, they're there for Ukraine anyways. Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer, the establishment of both parties, that's not the problem. The problem is the right and the left.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting to note that the Republicans used to be the party that wanted to keep Russia and the Soviet Union at bay, and now it's the other way around.
Yeah, that's actually a fascinating scenario. So certainly it was different during the Cold War. Actually, you did have Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson all essentially wanted somewhat of a relationship, of a confrontational relation. It was a confrontational relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. Nixon came in, wanted relaxation of tensions with the Soviet Union, détente. He institutes the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. Ford comes in. Ford does essentially the same thing. Ford wants SALT II. Ford goes to Helsinki, and in the Helsinki conference, basically the Soviet Union agrees to accept human rights. That was one of the biggest achievements of the Ford administration. Then and here's where I think is kind of an inflection point on the Republican Party on that. Alexander Solzhenitsyn comes to the United States, respectively, and when he comes to the United States, he wants to meet with President Ford. President Ford will not meet with them. He says in part because he does not meet with private citizens, because even though he had met with Pele, the famous soccer player, But Solzhenitsyn, part of it was if he had met with Solzhenitsyn, that would have inflamed the Soviet Union. That would have flamed Leonid Brezhnev. Okay. So Ford does not meet with him. And later on, he supposedly said that he thought that the only reason he was in the United States was to sell his book, which there probably was some veracity to. But Ronald Reagan decides after that, he decides I'm inflamed with that. We have to take on the Soviet Union. And he declares his presidential candidacy, runs to the right of Ford, runs against détente, runs against Kissinger, runs against Nixon, runs against Ford, says we need a more confrontational policy against the Soviet Union. He loses. Carter comes in, and Carter continues détente until Russia invades Afghanistan. When Russia invades Afghanistan, he goes out of he boycotts the mosque, he boycotts the Olympics, and he decides that the United States is once again going to have a confrontational role. Remember the grain embargo, all this other stuff with the Soviet Union. He increases military spending his last year in office. Ronald Reagan comes in himself in 1980, continues that policy. Eventually, Bush comes in the first 2 years in office, and Bush kind of tries to relaxation tensions again as the Soviet Union falls. But you have this scenario. What happens now that, for all these hawks? Do they continue to be hawks with the Soviet Union collapsing, or do they now go and become essentially doves? You have some folks like Pat Buchanan, who runs for president in 1992, who says the Cold War is over. Come home, America. He says America first. He actually said that. He said America first, last and only. And he basically says that the United States needs to fold up the tent, needs to get out of NATO, for example, because why should the United States continue to be on the hook for essentially losing American lives to defend countries when Russia's no longer when the Soviet Union is now dissipated, no longer part of the equation. Other conservatives like Bill Kristol, folks at the National Weekly Review, for example, become the neoconservative. They were neoconservatives. They kind of bring back the neoconservative movement and say we need to be where the hegemonic power. We need to have basically a world, a geopolitical situation where the United States is basically at the top. And we need to continue an arduous foreign policy, a strong foreign policy, and we need to take on Iraq. They say after the Gulf War, they said George H.W. Bush did not do enough. He should have gone after past Masrib. He should have gone after, and he should have taken out Saddam Hussein. 1995, Dick Cheney is one of these people who signed this. Donald Rumsfeld, the so-called PNAC letter. They signed a project for a new American century, basically urging Bill Clinton to take out Saddam Hussein militarily. Bill Clinton does, by the way, sign an act that basically says it's the United States policy to support regime change in Iraq. But that's really where the whole policy ended right after the Cold War. You either have the Pat Buchanan side of conservatives, which actually lost at the beginning, or you have the more hawkish view. And most conservatives were hawks. Most conservatives were hawks on Russia. Most conservatives supported NATO expansion. Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary all came into NATO. Conservatives worked with Bill Clinton to get that through. In 1997, now you have a scenario when Donald Trump becomes president, where Donald Trump criticizes NATO, and the idea he certainly would not. And I think folks like Pat Buchanan would say, why should the United States troops have to die for Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, all these other countries, now that Russia is no longer a nation? But we're now in a scenario where I think the Buchanan and I think Trump bloodline or wing of the Republican Party are now ascendant or hegemonic, if you will, over the Republican Party. And they are very much sympathetic to the needs of Russia. And they would say, they would say, why are we in this situation? Well, we inflamed Russia. We went into Kosovo, their cradle province, back in 1999. Right. We bombed Kosovo. They say, we've added all these other countries. And when you add countries to Russia, we add countries rather to NATO. They become new members of NATO. You're inflaming Russia because Russia all of a sudden is seeing all these threats. They're saying, why are all these NATO countries? You're going to build a military base here. You're going to build a military base here. You're going to military base here. So this is Putin putting his thumbs down, putting his hands down and saying, enough, no more NATO expansion. We stop it right here. So that is essentially why. And also, the other difference is Russia was once communist and they're no longer communist. So they're not kind of oligarchic. So that's another reason.
Yeah, on that, the Scandinavian countries would never have wanted to join if it hadn't been for the Ukraine thing. And Ukraine never would have made it in. Never would have made it into NATO. They didn't. And that being the case, then Russia didn't have really much to worry about NATO-wise if Ukraine wasn't going to ever become a NATO member. I don't think.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I hear that theory, but I kind of don't buy it.
That's basically it's interesting, and it certainly now you have countries actually coming into NATO. Actually, NATO actually did expand as a result of of Russia
Right.
going into the Ukraine. And you're probably right. There was not much of a constituency for bringing the Ukraine into NATO in the first place. And now there are certainly members of Congress that say, yeah, we should essentially bring the Ukraine in. Of course, if you bring the Ukraine in, you just inflame Putin more.
Right.
But I
And
think that
they don't really have what it takes to pass muster to get in at this time. They won't for a long time,
no,
economically and whatever.
I don't think it was about the Ukraine specifically per se. It was more about the idea of NATO expanding, and he was saying we have to put our foot down right here because you bring this country and you're going to bring this country. At least this is the master narrative of the Russians.
Right.
They would say that when the Cold War ended, James Baker promised Mikhail Gorbachev that they would not expand NATO, at least not to the east. This is over. We're going to keep the countries in NATO right now. And supposedly there was a verbal agreement between the two. And then in 1997, Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary all come into NATO. And that, along with the Kosovo invasion, supposedly is what, at least this would be Putin's master narrative, if you will. That is essentially what has really inflamed him. Now he's saying, this is we have to put a foot down, but obviously it didn't work because now all of a sudden new countries are coming into NATO. So that's counterintuitive to what his actual objective was. And now I don't think the fact that we're 300 days into this war, I think Putin thought this was going to be a quick war. It's going to be like, the United States and Grenada and Panama. He would kind of show who's hegemonic, and that would be it.
The upside of all this is that it really sends the message that this kind of adventurism by a country doesn't work out. It's super expensive and it's not worthwhile. I mean, it says to China, be cool, don't do that thing you're thinking about. And it says to North Korea, it might not be worth it. If they just marched in, they'd be saying, oh, well, we're going to do that too.
Fascinating. And Russia already went into the graveyard of empires in Afghanistan, which really helped in their losing of the Cold War, all the time and energy they spent there. Now they're doing essentially the same thing in Ukraine. It's very similar. That was very much similar to our Vietnam or our Korea when there was just these stalemates. And then eventually you think of how much resources that you essentially put in. But that's certainly kind of the non-interventionist credo. They would say, when you go into all these countries, we went into Haiti, we invaded the Dominican Republic, we went into Kosovo. I think actually Bosnia was probably one that was probably more of a victory because they were able to keep that peace back after the Dayton Accords in '95. Kosovo is arguable, although certainly they did stop Slobodan Milosevic from continuing to bomb the Kosovar population. But I think certainly Iraq, for example, I think that it's become almost ecumenical now that people are opposed to the idea of having gone into Iraq. There are very few, other than the most ardent neoconservatives, I think, who would say that it was, and probably George W. Bush himself, at least publicly, who would say that, yeah, if we had to do it all over again, the United States should have gone into Iraq. I think that most Republicans and Democrats now believe that it was a boondoggle.
I completely agree with the people I completely agree with the elder Bush not having gone in all the way to Baghdad. Stop, we're done. We accomplished our goal. And there's a certain geopolitical value in leaving Saddam Hussein there, as we see after toppling what a mess everything became. He bad guy, but he was the sheriff on the block that kept all these other entities at bay. Hey, we should go. We should go soon. Go ahead, finish up. You get the last word.
Also, he was somebody who had a Christian as his foreign minister in Tariq Aziz and had actually protected the Jewish population in his country, in part because for Saddam Hussein, it was about Saddam Hussein. Yeah, he was a Muslim, but he was not necessarily an Islamist. That's why folks like Osama bin Laden absolutely hated him, because he was somebody that he was seen as an autocrat. He was seen as an Arab nationalist. He was seen as somebody who was in it for himself. And he was seen as somebody who was an advocate for the idea of somewhat of a separation between church and state. Folks like Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda would much rather have had somebody who's more of an Islamist in Iraq.
Well, we could talk forever, I guess. So let's do it. Stop at about 1 hour. 1 hour and 4 minutes and 38 seconds. Rich Rubino, always a pleasure. We'll talk to you again real soon. And
I
everyone,
can't wait.
please,
Thanks so much, Bradley.
please do us a favor and share this. We work hard to share it with town groups and political groups. If you'd help us out, we would really both appreciate that. Thank you. Bye now. Bye, Rich.
Thanks so much, Bradley. Bye, everyone.
Okay.